question, Peter. Now, this fellow Torbett, for him to get this job at 19 years old, running this youth soccer league, I guess it was it just a team or was it a whole league?
It was a team. Was a team, and so youth football is quite heavily organised in Scotland. So you have different leagues, and I mean, I have 2 young children, and they both play for a youth team that's involved in its own league. At that time in Scotland in 1966, these kids would have played in youth leagues against other youth teams. So what Torbett did was he didn't set up a league. He set up a youth club that would play in a sort of set-up, an apparatus that was already in place. But he set up that club with the name and with the full backing at that time of the Celtic establishment.
And he was getting paid for this role? As employment?
Well, that's a matter of contention. In Torbett's case, no. In previous other paedophile coaches that have been convicted, the Celtic contend that they weren't. The lawyers say that they have evidence that they were. For the actual civil case itself, it's not necessary to actually prove they were being paid. But what Torbett did was, well, obviously, he benefited massively personally from his association with this enormous sporting institution. And he had his own business which he set up, which sold football memorabilia. And as time progressed, his business expanded greatly to the point where he became a self-made millionaire through his football memorabilia business while being closely involved with the boys' club. He employed other men to work at his businesses selling this memorabilia, some of whom are now convicted paedophiles. Some of the abuse Torbett committed was on his business premises, selling these trophies and football, football memorabilia. And at least 2 members of the Celtic Board of Directors were also directors of his private trophy club business. So Torbett didn't need to be paid, is my view. Torbett was able, through his idea to market memorabilia. Back in the late 60s, the idea of football memorabilia and making money through merchandise was, was really nowhere.
Right.
And he had this idea, and given his connections with the hierarchy that ran that club, he was able to construct a business that became successful very quickly.
How many years did he work coaching this team here without compensation from the Celtic Boys Club?
Well, the timeline is a bit hazy in terms of Torbett and what his actual activities were. You can get some idea of it when you go through the archives. There's a large library in Glasgow called the Mitchell Library. It's actually one of the biggest reference libraries in Europe, so you can go in and read the books, but it's not a lending library. You can't take things out. And in the Mitchell Library is an archive of Celtic's official club newspaper. Now, that is the newspaper that is officially sanctioned by the club. It's not a fanzine. It's the official newspaper of the club. And in this library, they have every edition dating back to the late 1960s. And in it, you can see how Torbett was present for quite a long time, for maybe about 4 or 5 years, up until the start of the 70s. Then he disappears from view for a while. And this is when allegations apparently were brought to the senior management of the club that untoward things were going on. He was replaced by a man called Frank Kearney. Now, Frank Kearney was not a successful businessman, but unlike Torbett, was actually a very good football coach. Torbett had no football experience and wasn't a good coach. He wasn't a football coach. He was just the man with the idea and the business idea which he used to make himself very wealthy. Kearney, who comes in as Torbett disappears from view, is himself a convicted paedophile and started abusing the boys almost immediately he arrived at Celtic to be the coach. There is some dispute as to how he was paid. He didn't seem to have any other form of income. Back in the 70s, it was probably cash in hand. Who knows? But he was not a wealthy man. people can draw their own conclusions, but he was a bachelor. He, as all these Celtic paedophiles were, they were all bachelors. It's hard to think how he could have sustained himself without getting some kind of stipend from the club or some kind of remuneration, because how else could he support himself? Because if you read these Celtic View archives from the early 70s onwards, the guy's in it every week. He writes a column for it. He doesn't seem to do anything else with his life but coach these kids. So how else could he have supported himself? People can draw their own conclusion about that. But as I understand it, that doesn't necessarily form a central part of the civil case, because, liability can be proved other ways. He doesn't need to have been a paid employee on the books. And back in the early 70s in Scotland, the idea that, people would have necessarily have been on the books, it's very easy to believe that people were just paid cash in hand.
Oh, yeah,
I'm sure
absolutely.
There were many businesses.
Yeah. Myself, I was born in '62, and I remember when they tore down Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. I guess it was in the early '70s. Me and my dad would go there to the construction site, and they would sell the memorabilia from Yankee Stadium, like framed pictures of Babe Ruth in a suit signing his contracts, stuff like that. Yeah, right. But for like $4, $5, it was, you don't become a millionaire, or now you do, or maybe like in the 80s and the 90s you did, but you didn't become a millionaire back in the 60s and the 70s selling that stuff. Okay, and I'm sure you didn't in Scotland over there. Okay, was there ever been any allegation with this bunch that they received some kind of compensation for giving people access to these little boys?
No, not that I've seen. No.
Okay.
No, it's not a paedophile ring in that way. They were not procuring children and then passing them on. Well, they were procuring children for themselves, and they did have links with paedophiles in other parts of Scotland and in other parts of the United Kingdom. But kids for money, no, I've seen no evidence of that at all. What Torbett was able to do was to make himself very wealthy by selling this memorabilia through a series of shops which he was able to open, and he had the exclusive contract from Celtic at that time to sell this merchandise. And it would appear there was a lot of money in it, because in the latest episode of the podcast, episode 7, one survivor talks about how he watched the business grow and grow and grow, and shops popped up in cities and towns throughout Scotland because Celtic are enormously supported, and if you wanted to buy official Celtic merchandise, you had to go to one of these shops.
Gotcha. Hey, remember in the pre-interview I was going to answer a question and I forgot what it was. The question was, I just remembered, how often do you release podcasts? Do you have a weekly episode comes out on the same day each week?
Well, I tried to do one a week, or I started off saying it'd be one a fortnight. And then when things got going, because I had quite a lot of material already, then I started doing one a week because I wanted to try and build up some momentum. And I also, because I know quite a lot of journalists in Scotland, they were quite interested in what I'd discovered. So there had been quite a few articles in the press in Scotland about the podcast and about what was in the podcast. Or they would report it and then give me a credit, which is fine. But then, it was the summer holidays. We were out the country on holiday. So then it went down to one a fortnight. And, I'm doing this in my spare time. I do have other jobs. I lecture at the local university, in international journalism. So I've got all these other jobs. I've got 2 young kids. So then it went down to one a fortnight. So I'm going to try and do them as often as I can. There might be some times where it comes out one week after the other. Then I might need to take a break. But it certainly will never be longer than one a fortnight.
And a fortnight is once a month?
No, once every 2 weeks.
Once every 2 weeks. Okay, well, you learn something new every day. Okay, great. Okay, and let's see. Okay, so I was asking about how often the show comes out. Now, what made Peter Henderson want to devote the entire podcast to this one topic?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. if you've got a journalistic background, or anyone actually, because there's a lot of people who devote their own time to this and are very interested in this, when you realise just what a massive story it is, even though, when I had worked as a news producer, I'd never really worked in crime, but it becomes all-consuming almost. I mean, the injustice of it is absolutely monstrous. And I also built up, personal relationships with many of the men who've been affected. So when I worked for the law firm, these guys would become involved with the law firm and taking on their case, but a lot of them also wanted to, speak about what had happened to them. So it was my job to, talk to them, arrange TV interviews for them, radio interviews and so on, and maintain contact with them. And you can't help but be affected when you are dealing with people, this huge trauma that's happened to them when they were children, and when you see the effect that it's had on them in terms of, their mental health. People have, drug problems, alcohol problems because of this abuse. And, I'm the father of 2 young children who both love football. You cannot help but become emotionally involved. And I guess that, it's all very well me being, setting up interviews and making sure the survivors are safe and that they're speaking to the right kind of journalists and so on. But there's only so much you can get from a newspaper article. And when, you hear someone being interviewed in a podcast and you can hear the emotion in their voice and you can hear the pain that has been inflicted on them by what this group of men did to these kids all these years ago, you feel driven to do it.
I understand.
You give up your time and you bore all your friends and relatives, saying, "Oh my goodness, you're not thinking or talking about that again." But I'm sure you've found this yourself,
sure.
And many of the people that you've interviewed. I guess it's the injustice of it, and the fact that a wrong has been done and responsibility has not been taken and apologies have not been given, and you just do it. And I guess I'm lucky that because I worked as a news producer for so long, I was able to construct this podcast, and I wasn't a big podcast listener at all. So basically what I'm doing is constructing mini radio documentaries. That's the way they're constructed, with edited interviews, with introductions, interview outros, clips, and so on. And yeah, I feel that I wanted to help these men, do it in a way that was safe for them, that they trust me, which is good, because, you get people that want to become involved that are not honest players,
Sure.
And I knew that I was, and, that I would be fair and not indulge in kind of wild speculation or crazy conspiracy theories, because you don't have to, because the truth itself is outrageous enough, that this was an enormous cover-up of decades-long industrial-scale child abuse against children who only wanted to play football.
So let me ask you, Peter, how many children do you think were traumatized throughout the system? Hundreds.
I've no doubt about it. If you consider that this began in 1966 and it didn't end until the early 90s, and that there were numerous coaches involved, and it didn't have to be coaches that were actively involved at Celtic. Some of the abuse, in fact, a lot of the abuse, was happening at other small junior youth soccer teams in small towns throughout central Scotland. And these coaches, who were paedophiles, were in contact with the paedophiles working at Celtic Football Club. But the connecting point in all of this abuse was that these coaches could say to these kids and the parents of the kids, "Your kid has to come here, he has to train with me because there's a chance that he might get a trial for Celtic." That was always the carrot that the paedophiles dangled in front of the kids and their parents,